Okay, so next question from Bird Monster. Also, I'll probably tie in a question here from Brian Stevens because it's probably going to tread the same ground. So Bird Monster's question is, would the Intrepid be a light cruiser in the World War II definition? And Brian Stevens' question is, aren't frigates smaller than destroyers? And I feel like because the Intrepid we described as a frigate, it's gonna come up.
Yeah. Okay. So it depends what era you're looking at. So this is one of the cases of ship classes going in and out of style, partly because of necessity, partly because of them getting too big, partly because the role disappears and then reappears. So in the time period that we are kind of roughly earmarked as the closest fit for Star Trek shipping, which was the end of the 19th century, frigates at that point, the ones that are left, are kind of, they're holdovers from the Age of Sail a bit. They're also around in the early ironclad era, but they are considerably larger than destroyers. Because destroyers at this point, they're torpedo boat destroyers or destroyers. They're pretty small ships. They're one step above an attack craft, whereas the frigate is a small cruising ship. But the cruiser has kind of partly supplanted the frigate and partly outgrown it as well. So in the late 19th century, a destroyer is a considerably smaller ship than a frigate. The reason the confusion comes in is that then the frigate goes out of use completely towards the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, only to be brought back again in World War II as an alternative for the somewhat more ungainly twin-screw corvette, which is also, the corvette also goes out of fashion in terms of use in the 19th century. But then when they bring back these small anti-submarine craft, first you have the Flower-class corvettes in World War II, and then they bring up things like the Hunt-class destroyers and the River-class, what are going to be called twin-screw corvettes, because they're a bit bigger, they've got two propellers, and someone goes, that sounds like a dumb idea, what else can we do? And someone's like, oh, well, frigates used to be bigger than corvettes. They're like, oh, we'll call them frigates then. And so the frigate then in World War II slots in behind the destroyer in terms of displacement, which is where it stayed, roughly speaking, ever since. So a modern frigate is smaller than a destroyer, but a frigate at the time that we've sort of pegged Star Trek as being most analogous to is larger.
Yes. I mean, possibly it's, as you say, with that whole Jacob's Ladder cycle, it's possible, so it's possible that, like, it kind of would get to a point where, at one point in Star Trek history, maybe the frigates were larger than destroyers, and then, it just depends where you are in that cycle. Yeah,
and to be honest, one of the main reasons that frigates died out was because the thing that had defined the frigate for literally hundreds of years. I mean, the frigate as a definition goes all the way back to the late Tudor, early Stuart times. But it was basically, the definition of a frigate was a vessel that you could bring, a ship of the line, a ship that you could bring into a major battle, but had a single deck of guns.
Right.
And that was basically the foundation of what a frigate was, which had already started to cause some issues in the beginning of the ironclad period, because most, what we would term battleships, first rates, whatever you want to call them, when you got to armoured vessels like HMS Warrior, they also had a single gun deck, because they were now mounting considerably larger guns. And so people were looking at things like Warrior and going, well, it's a single gun deck ship, and it goes in the line of battle, therefore it must be a frigate, but also it's bigger and more powerful than any first-rate ship of the line anyone has, which makes calling it a frigate a bit absurd.
Yes.
So the definition started to slip a little bit, and then people started introducing the concept of cruisers as a class rather than as a mission profile. And that's why the frigate kind of slips away into retirement for a little bit. But I think when it comes to an Intrepid, I think partly because of its size, but also partly because of what we see them being used for, it does fit a little bit better into the frigate categorization than a light cruiser. Because, well, we're using kind of the protected cruisers as light cruisers, but with protected scribbled out and light put in the way. And if you think about the first, second, and third class light, quote unquote, light cruisers, what are their mission profiles? Well, the first class are kind of your fleet scouts and fleet pickets defending the core of your fleet. Does the Intrepid do that mission? Not really. Second class, they do the same as the first class, but slightly less independently. So they sort of act in bigger units, and when they're overseas, they might not go alone. They might go with a friend or two, sort of showing the flag, that kind of thing. Does Intrepid do that? Arguably, possibly, it could, but we don't see it do that. We don't see groups of Intrepids moving around the way we see groups of Excelsiors or Mirandas. And then the third class is, you're kind of, well, we vaguely got some weapons and a badge showing that we're part of a larger group. So don't mess with us. And the Intrepid is a bit bigger and heftier than that.
Yes. Well, I was going to say, actually, because we couldn't think of any third class off the top of our head. And then I went back and thought, well, what about I think kind of you suggested it with the Curry. And I thought, well, yeah, what about all those kit bashes? And the newest one would be like the California class from Lower Decks. Which is certainly big. It certainly throws itself into a cruiser kind of size because it's like 500 odd meters long. It's a big ship. But it is, in capabilities, it is like barely there. And whereas the Intrepid it's much like the New Orleans, which they're both frigates. It's a small galaxy. It's a miniaturized capital ship. Yeah,
which is it's a bit of a throwback in mission roles back to the 18th and early 19th centuries. But that's why frigate is really the more appropriate moniker for it, because it's small, but small ships in the light cruiser or protected cruiser category don't do those missions. And it does these missions, but in the cruiser categories, those missions will be conducted by a ship considerably larger than it.
Yes.
But which is why there's no perfect analogy, basically. There's close to, but not perfect.
Yeah, it's quite a messy comparison. Okay, the next question from Bird Monster is, the Galaxy and Akira are sort of hybrid, previously mentioned, hybrid carriers. Was this tried outside of, I don't know if this is beyond your sort of time periods, outside of Soviet aircraft cruisers? And how was the concept fared in reality, and then how would it fare in Star Trek?
So the idea of hybrid carriers, or battle carriers, if you like, has been tried on and off. The British, you could argue, technically tried it with HMS Vindictive. In World War One, you could technically argue they tried it with HMS Furious in its early forms, although that was more just necessity rather than any deliberate attempts to have the world's most heavily armed carrier. Then the Japanese tried it with Issei Ryuga in World War II. The Russians built, well, they drew a bunch of designs for building, but never got around to actually trying it. But also, pretty much everybody at one point or another looked at battle carriers as a concept. The Americans drew up a ton of designs, everything from cruiser carriers through heavy cruiser carriers, battle cruiser carriers, and battleship carriers. And the British, although they didn't quite embrace it design-wise with quite the same enthusiasm as the Americans, they did also look at the idea as a whole. The problems that the battle carrier encounters historically is that, well, it doesn't do anything particularly well, and it mixes all the vulnerabilities together. So if you have a battle carrier of whatever class, like cruiser, heavy cruiser, battleship, etc., it has fewer guns than an equivalent that's just purely dedicated to guns. So it can't win a straight-up gunfight. And the carrier element means you've got the huge exposed, very vulnerable to damage area that's also happens to be chock full of, lovely things like bombs and aviation fuel. So putting the thing in a direct peer-on-peer combat is a very easy way to lose it. It also can't go toe-to-toe with a full-on fleet carrier in an air battle because it doesn't have anywhere like the same number of aircraft. And so it can't win against either of the dedicated ships. And it has, as I say, it has these huge vulnerabilities against carrier aircraft. It has the vulnerability that its guns don't give it enough fighters to see off the enemy attackers. And we already talked about what happens if it comes up against a peer gun vessel. So they're only really useful in theory if you can go up against ships that are smaller than you. Like if you have a battleship carrier, if you went up against a cruiser, you've probably still got the firepower to deal with the cruiser. But you've also got the caveat the cruiser could do a lot of damage with a few lucky hits to your carrier section. Of course, you could argue that your battle carrier might have an advantage in that, it might have fewer guns, but it can at least maybe hold its own long enough for its aircraft to come into play.
Yes.
But the prep time and launch time for those aircraft is far too long.
Right.
And you've still got the problem that, yes, your aircraft might eventually kill the other ship, but in the interim, that other ship may have reduced you to a flame as well.
Yeah, and then they've got nowhere to land.
Exactly. So it's never quite a practical concept in real life. In Star Trek, they do have this. Probably the single biggest advantage in Star Trek is that because you don't have to worry about gravity and air, not aeronautics.
Aerodynamics.
That's it. Yes, thank you. Aerodynamics. You don't have to have a massive, great flight deck.
Yes, you can put hangars just about anywhere you want on the ship, although they still kind of make a concession. Most ships make a concession to the horizontal, apart from just like some.
But you can have them fully enclosed, except for the bit where everything exits. I mean, as you say, you've got the through and through on the Akira, but even then, munitions, whatever they happen to be, micro torpedoes or whatever, and fuel. Well, fuel is probably stored in the ship's main antimatter reserves anyway, so it's not equivalent to the specifically very combustible aviation gas, which is stored on real-life carriers. And to be honest, things like micro torpedoes and stuff are probably also stored with the ship's main magazines.
Yes.
So a lot of the vulnerable points of a real-life battle carrier are not present in Star Trek, which makes them a slightly more viable concept.
Yeah, the only ship that kind of falls afoul of that is the USS Discovery, because it has that massive open-backed shuttle bay.
Yeah.
But it's not a carrier, it's a science ship, apart from when it is a carrier. We won't get into the season 2.
And a Tardis.
That we don't need to. That was a long time ago. We've moved on.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the whole battle carrier concept, I don't see it too often in Star Trek. Like, even the Akira, yes, it does carry fighters. That more feeds into the fact that it's a ship that is kind of designed to engage at long range. It only has 2 phaser arrays. It's more designed to sit at long range with torpedoes. And if you're sitting at long range with torpedoes, maybe you will just have fighters as well to kind of, that's something else that can almost sort of follow your torpedoes in.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the Akira always struck me as, although obviously it can, as you say, it carries fighters, but as a fleet ship, bearing in mind that when it's designed, they're thinking about fighting the Borg, where it is very much going to be a fleet effort. I've always thought that perhaps the Akiras were there as much to support the rest of the fleet with their hangar capacity as they were to directly attack with their own fighters, i.e., if you have your hypothetical Borg invasion and everybody goes in and everyone and their dogs, like shuttles, runabouts, fighters, everything's just being spammed out of various hangar bays to do something. But a lot of the ships that are going up close and personal may either be lost or badly damaged, or they're going to be like the Defiant was in First Contact and various others. They're going to be maneuvering like crazy, which is going to make coming back to refuel, rearm, and repair a little difficult.
Yes.
Whereas if you've got a bunch of Akiras sitting in the back field and just lobbing torpedoes at the cube, they're also a relatively stable platform to which everybody can just return, rearm, and pop back out again.
Yes. So, I mean, the only other kind of thing I was thinking in other sci-fi was, of course, the Star Destroyer in Star Wars, but actually it kind of falls into the problems of, it kind of doesn't ever happen because everyone else is also fielding battle carriers in Star Wars.
Yes.
The exception would maybe be the Separatists, who sometimes sort of, bodge fighters wherever they can fit because they're droids, who cares, whatever. Yeah. We don't need a dedicated. But if the Separatists built a dedicated, and all the larger Separatist ships are dedicated, again, battle carriers. If you had a large Separatist ship that was kind of based off like the Munificent or the the Recusant class, which are the real anti-ship focused. They have very limited carrying capacity. If you built something at that size on a Star Destroyer level, or that capability on a Star Destroyer level, and put it up against a Star Destroyer, I would not be surprised if the Star Destroyer came off worse.
Yeah, and also in Star Wars you have the Mon Cal cruisers, which yes, they carry fighters and bombers, but they carry far fewer than a Star Destroyer does.
Right.
But they're also, unless you're talking about something like Home 1, the average Mon Cal cruiser, at least according to most of the sources that I've seen, is actually somewhat smaller than a Star Destroyer. They're kind of in the 1,1300 meter range as opposed to the 1,600 meters of an Imperial Star Destroyer. And yet they are either capable of going toe-to-toe with, or in some cases just being flat-out superior to, an Imperial class or Imperial 2 Star Destroyer. Which kind of is like, okay, so at that point, the Mon Cals are focusing more on endurance, and although they don't have more guns, they probably have slightly heavier guns, and their fighter capability is much more of an afterthought. It's kind of almost, if you want to use a more modern analogy, it's almost more equivalent to just having a somewhat extensive helicopter pad at the back rather than a battle carrier. And therefore, in this much smaller volume, they're actually able to take on the much larger battle carrier on equal or better footing. Yes.
Yeah, so that was the kind of the main example I was thinking of. But I think we've answered that question. So the next question from Bird Monster is about, we talked about Captain Janeway having Tri-Cobalt warheads as she went into the Badlands to chase the Maquis for no particular reason. Just have. Now, his speculation is that quantum torpedo, give it away there, that Tri-Cobalt warheads were actually a quantum torpedo stand-in. That, you have this older technology which works. It kind of achieves a similar effect. It's a very destructive weapon. And the main thing is that it is more available than the quantum torpedo, which is still quite new and hard to come by. And he was asking if there would be any is there any real life equivalence of that?
I don't think there's a direct real life equivalent, because if you sort of look at the latter part of the 20th century, about the closest you can think of would be the various inventive, extremely large or powerful explosive devices people have built because they want to bring destruction on an extremely large scale, but they don't want to use a nuke because nukes are forbidden. So you get things like the Russian fuel air explosive bombs, the American Moab, which is basically the same, the daisy cutters that they were using in Vietnam. So those would technically fall into that kind of, we're retrofitting an older school of technology, although in that case it's like an older method of it causing explosions. But that's more, as I said, because everybody kind of frowns on dropping tactical nukes everywhere for some
Yes.
reason. But there's no real prohibition against using quantum torpedoes apart from apparently they just seem to be somewhat difficult to get hold of.
Well,
No
so
one reacts with the horror of, oh no, they've used a quantum torpedo. This is going to lead to a strategic escalation.
I kind of like the idea. Maybe it's just like the image of, people, inserting, those little keys into their control panel, lifting a button so they can then fire a quantum torpedo. But the reason I'm just thinking that is because quantum torpedoes were developed specifically for anti-Borg purposes. And I do wonder if because also it's like it messes with the fabric of reality, because it like causes a vacuum in the space-time continuum.
Yeah.
So you can almost veer into it being like a subspace weapon, which is illegal. It's sort of treading a line. And I kind of almost get the impression that, yes, and basically saying, okay, you can use these as long as it's just on the Borg and not on anyone civilized, which much like the Federation only using the Romulan cloaking device in the Gamma Quadrant goes out of the window the moment stuff really starts.
Yeah, so then once the Federation's like, actually, these are really useful. And then everyone else is kind of sitting back and going, yeah, how do we stop them now that they've got them?
Yeah, so possibly actually there was, this is speculation, but possibly there was some kind of treaty which said no quantum torpedoes on, non-Borg.
Yeah.
And Janeway wanted to, or Janeway's captain, but wanted to scare the absolute shit out of the Maquis, and thought, well, I can't use quantum torpedoes because of this stupid treaty, so I'll use the next best thing.
Yeah. I think it's not a perfect analogy, but perhaps the closest I can come up with from the period of naval history I mostly look at would maybe be something like Superchargers. So this was a thing that was done in World War One for monitors, but then for some capital ships in World War Two, where you had older battleships that couldn't elevate their guns as high as modern battleships, and that meant that their range was significantly reduced. And so in order to enable them to at least have a fighting chance, so they're not just going to sit there and be pummeled beyond their ability to reach out and fight back, a number of them, certainly in the Royal Navy, were equipped with what were called superchargers, which was basically when the amount of powder or cordite or whatever you're using to propel your shell is decided upon, you know how much pressure the breach can take, and then you walk it back with a safety factor, because you don't want to risk it being, obviously quality control varies slightly. You don't want to risk blowing your gun up. You don't want to risk stripping the rifling on your barrel very quickly. So there's a fairly big safety factor built in for normal charges. And then they went, okay, actually, what if we strip out most of the safety factor and just leave it like 1 gram below the level where it might actually detonate the gun, and then we'll stick that charge in and see how far the shell goes. And this gave the ships with the superchargers a bit more range, a bit more armor penetration capability on their shells, and it meant that at least in theory they could now go toe-to-toe with ships they might run into without being completely hopelessly outranged. So that kind of semi-upgrading of old tech, so it can kind of match new tech, but not quite. Whereas obviously refit ships and brand new ships would have higher elevating guns and more modern guns and so on and so forth. In principle, to me, would seem to be the closest analogy to the idea of a tricobalt warhead being so kind of the best thing we can fit in this photon torpedo casing that doesn't make it a quantum torpedo kind of thing.
Yes. I mean, I'm just thinking with that idea of supercharging, that just reminded me of what they did in Enterprise with the phase cannons originally.
Yes.
That is a new technology that they're actually feeling out its capabilities. not the other end. So there is a bit of a difference there. Right, okay, so last question from Bird Monster. I think we know the answer to this by now. If you could command a Starfleet ship, what would you command?
Probably an ambassador.
Oh, okay, that surprised me.
Yeah, no, much as the galaxy deeply appeals to me, and the Sovereign also deeply appeals to me, if I was going into battle or into a war, being in a sovereign or a galaxy to me screams, "Look at me! I'm a critical target. Please shoot me." Which doesn't appeal to me that much. Whereas an ambassador is almost as big, almost as scary. And if I was the captain and I was telling Dominion War has broken out, here is your command of your ambassador class starship, I'd just be like, right, everybody, you're going to learn how to sleep in hammocks again. Chief engineer, here's like infinite resources for your industrial replicators. Put as much ablative armor, shielding, extra generators, and phaser arrays as you can possibly get in my extensive volume of hull. So when somebody shoots at me, they're going to be very surprised. Dominion cruiser swoops in and launches 24 Polar-on torpedoes. Swoops off expecting yet another easy kill chalked up, and then as the radiation dissipates, I'm just standing there. It's like, great, my turn.
That's a good choice, I have to say. I do like the ambassador. I mean, you do basically end up with the debate of the ambassador or the Narendra. That's a tough choice. I think for me, I'd go for Dominion War. I think I'd go with the Steam Runner because you're just coated in heavy armor.
Yes,
and you're relatively nuggety size. You're not massive, but you're not small either. You're a nice sort of size when no one really knows what to do with you. And you aren't particularly heavily armed. You've got phasers and torpedoes, but you're just so densely armored that no one's going to be able to really do much damage, especially if you operate in a group.
Yeah.
So, and you can really get into the thick of it. Have a real.
So you're being a good Starfleet officer and thinking in terms of the capabilities of the ship that would be given to you. whereas I'm the devious type who looks at the ship and goes, "How much hull volume is there, and how much will people underestimate me once I start filling it with things that aren't supposed to be there?"
That's cheating. That's you're breaking the naval treaties probably.
Yeah, I would be the kind of Starfleet captain who, you sit me as part of the regular battle line in face off of 300 or 400 ships, and then there's just this little twanging sound as I suddenly volley fire a 10 torpedo spread from a launcher I've stolen from a Galaxy class production line. And I'm an older ship, so I don't have quantum torpedoes, but I just, as we throw back to what we were mentioning a few minutes ago, I've just stuck 10 tricobalt warheads on there, and suddenly half the Dominion battle line disappears in a blaze of subspace flux and horrific radiation. And everyone's like, I think he just committed a war crime. And then you look around, it's like, yeah, well, we've got to catch him first, because I'm then dove in afterwards to finish off the survivors.
Brilliant. Okay. One more big question, and then just one little question after that. So from Jin Wergra, how many should be crewing a Klingon bird of prey, Burrell class? Because 12, as described in Search for Spock, feels too small. Now, there is another number given. I believe it's in one of the DS9 episodes, which is 36. We've also got the Klingon Bird of Prey Haynes manual. It's very, very good, actually. It's very entertaining. I don't agree with everything in it. It has some strange ideas about how it achieves warp speed, but it actually comes up with a pretty plausible explanation for the ship's sort of crew size and shift patterns, and 36 does about work out, because yes, okay, the bird of prey is about 110 meters long, but it is very slim.
Yeah, there's not a lot of volume to it.
So you can't really cram in. I mean, I did talk with because one of the things a Klingon bird of prey can do is land on a planet. So one of the things that it would be very useful for is augmenting a landing force. You have a Klingon bird of prey swoop into atmosphere, fire its disruptor cannons at ground targets. I mean, that's going to be pretty brutal. Yeah. And then you can drop, then you can land and drop a load of angry Klingon warriors. And we concluded that we looked at the cargo bay from Voyage Home, which in itself is a bit of a inconsistent set. Like it's shot from multiple angles, comes off as different sizes. How do you fit 2 humpback whales in there?
With difficulty.
With a great deal of difficulty, but we concluded that probably you could fit about a platoon, about 30 men in that shuttle bay, cargo bay, sorry. And so that would be 30 guys who are purely there to just be ready for the ground assault. Then you would still have your 36 for operating the ship. In terms of how smaller crew you can get away with, about 12. That is, I think, the minimum. And then, the other 24 beam aboard the enemy ship station and get to work with disruptors and batleths.
Yeah, I have a feeling it probably comes down to, especially with 36 being divisible by 12, I think it probably comes down to crew rotation, because you actually see this on a lot of, warships of the time that I look at, and also even modern warships. The number of people you need on board as an absolute minimum to run the ship is far, far less than what you actually need for general crewing, because most ships operate on a 3-shift pattern. So you need 3 of everything, three lots of engineers, 3 lots of weapons, etc., and so forth. And you need redundancy in case somebody gets sick, somebody gets injured or killed in battle, etc. And everybody needs rest. So I think it comes down to kind of endurance and how closely you want to work your crew to the bone. So on something like a Burrell, well, if you think about it, what do you actually need? You need someone in command. You need someone on sensors, someone on weapons, someone on navigation, and someone in engineering as an absolute minimum. Well, that's 6 people. So obviously people can't stay awake 24/7 or however many hours there are in a Klingon day. So your absolute minimum would be double that, so which is 12, because then you have 1 lot come on, 1 lot go off and sleep, back and forth. But working 12-hour days, there's going to be a hard limit on how long you can actually stay out doing that before fatigue and everything starts to creep in. And also you're relying on absolutely everybody being available, and there's probably going to have to be people doubled up, because that doesn't count for things like medical staff. So someone's going to have medical training, but if someone goes down, that means you're down 2 people, or you're going to have to wake a couple of people up, which they're probably not too pleased about. So and whereas if you've got 12 crew on a shift, that allows you to double up on everything. So you've got 2 people in engineering and so on and so forth, which obviously you don't need 2 sensor officers and 2 weapons officers, etc. So that then allows you your ancillary stuff like cooks, if you don't rely on replicators, medical staff, general maintenance duties, etc. And that then works as a whole shift. Then multiply that by 3, because you have 3 8-hour shifts, and you have a crew of 36. Which is kind of basically, I think, means if you've got a crew of 12, you can just about run the ship, but you're not going to run it for too long. Versus the crew of 36, you can basically run as long as your air and your food supplies run.
Yes, I mean, I'm just thinking also because it's a thing that's been of discussion recently, but the idea of crew fatigue. If you just leave someone plonked in front of the the sensor screen for 8 hours a day, and most of the time nothing happens, and then suddenly everything happens, but he's so disengaged he doesn't realize until the enemy ship is right on top of them.
Exactly.
And that's where having like 2 people a ship, so maybe actually, in total, he's only spending 4 of those hours actually looking at the sensor screen, and the other 4 he's cleaning or he's making some food.
And I think actually, in some ways, although it may not have been intentional, I think you actually see this reflected in DS9. Because you think about the Rotaran's crew, we only ever see about a dozen people.
Yeah.
And obviously everyone would be all hands on deck when they're going into battle. Now, that makes me think 2 things. Because one, when we see the Rotaran and other similar birds of prey in operation, one of the things I noticed is that unlike TNG or even earlier episodes of DS9 when the Defiant was wandering around the Gamma Quadrant, you basically never see the Rotaran and company, just, hello, we're out here merrily killing Jem'Hadar. It's always, this is our mission, we're leaving, we're going to do the mission, we're coming back again.
Yes. Well, that comes back to the size, that it's an attack ship and not a larger crew.
But I'm also thinking, if you've only got a dozen crew on the Rotaran, that's probably all you can do. You can run a dozen crew in 2 shifts and probably expect decent performance out of them for a week, but no longer. So then that makes sense. If they're based on the state on DS9 or wherever, they're rested, relaxed. The ship's just kind of there, and then they go out. They're out for 2-3 days getting to the target. They fight the battle. They come back again, and now they're back out to rest again, which makes sense. They're basically operating short-staffed.
Yes.
Which may or may not, again, this is somewhat headcanon, but it kind of matches what you see on screen. I kind of also wonder whether that's intentional on the part of the Klingons, because you don't see birds of prey in the numbers. You don't see ships generally in the numbers that you do in the Dominion War, but the balance of Borels versus everything else is much lower pre-Dominion War. They're usually operating on their own. You see as many Vultures or Katingas as birds of prey. Then suddenly in the Dominion War, there's like birds of prey coming out of your ears. And I kind of wonder if maybe that, again, it's headcanon speculation, but if the Klingons were thinking along those kinds of lines, and maybe they just had a Borel production line somewhere that was just churning them out, and there were vast heaps of Borels sitting in reserves. And during peacetime, they're running Borels with 36 crew, and they're wandering around doing their long distance missions and what have you. And then when it comes time for war, they just neatly divide the crews into 3 and go, right, 2/3 of the crew, you're going off to crew another 2 Borels. Now we have a 3 Borel strong squadron before we had 1. Yes, you can't go off merrily on your own for months at a time, but we don't need you to. We need you to stay around this station or this starbase or this planet, and we're going to send you off to do specific TAC missions, and then you're going to come back again. So the fact you've only got 1/3 of your crew doesn't matter.
Yes, I think that definitely does. That makes sense on multiple levels, because then also what you're doing is you've got, not only do you have a crew, you have an experienced crew.
Yeah.
That being said, I'm just thinking about the casualty rates, and if you intend your Borel crew to be your most experienced, that seems to be a kind of flawed idea, because those are going to be the first ones to get blown up.
Mind you, if you lose a Borel, you've only lost 1/3 of an experienced crew instead of all.
That is true. That is true. And the other thing is just the kind of how it contrasts with early employment of the Borel back during the 23rd century, where it was much less of that swarming force, and it was much more of in that sort of reconnaissance and support role.
Yeah. And I suppose in something like really desperate like the Dominion War, you could even split the crews further, because as we just established, technically speaking, to keep the ship running at any given period, you actually only need a minimum of 6. For a few hours at least. At which point, if you have your 36-man crew, if you're going full mobilization for the Dominion War, you could split your 36-strong Borel crew into 6 crews of 6, and then you call up your reservists, and you make up each Borel's 12-man crew with 6 reservists and 6 experienced officers. And you operate on your shift pattern, and then when the red alert klaxon sounds and you're going into battle, the experienced officers are going to be there anyway because everyone's there. So you haven't lost too much combat effectiveness, but then you've turned one long distance patrol ship into 6 shorter range attack ships, assuming that you have the attack ships lying around somewhere, or the magical Burrell factory is working properly.
Yeah. It's called Hallmark.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is now just a minor peeve, though. I don't know why you would have. Here's a problem I have. I don't know why you would. As far as I'm concerned, the Klingon Fleet Command, in terms of its rank structure, is actually a Marine force, because they have terms like general and colonel and things like that. So I think it's an extension of a Marine force. That was how it originally came about. Anyway, so a captain is still. I mean, it's not a particularly senior officer. But I suppose, it is lower down. But I would have thought with a Burrell, you'd command that thing with like a lieutenant.
Yeah, you might well do so, although there is also the naval convention that no matter what rank they are, the person in charge of the ship is the captain.
It's called a captain. There is that. But equally, like, you say that, but then again, the Romulans call their captains commanders.
Yeah, the Romulans are a bit special.
Yeah, and like...
The Romulans are kind of stuck halfway in the Roman period, though, so...
Yes. Oh, don't start me. I had a conversation earlier, the fruits of which come out. I got a whole lesson in Latin.
Yeah. I suspect that also the Burrells would have been actually a fairly popular posting, because obviously... the Klingons do seem to like kind of ranking up and gaining notoriety via kills. So if you're constantly being sent on short-range attack missions, that's probably actually the greatest opportunity for glory in battle, because if you're on a Vorcha, you might be stuck on, like, here's the border patrol, you're stuck on this mission for 3 months, you may or may not encounter anybody. If you do, you can kill them, but other than that, this is what you have to do for the larger campaign.
Yeah.
So a Vorcha crew, you might take down a Galore or a Dominion cruiser or something, but that may be the only thing you take down in a 3-month period. Meanwhile, your little 12-man short-staffed Burrells in that 3-month period might have been sent out on half a dozen attack missions, each one of which might have had the opportunity to rack up a couple of kills. So... you might start off with a bunch of lieutenants and lieutenant commanders and so forth in charge of the Burrells, but as the war goes on, they're very quickly going to get renown and honour in the Klingon Defence Force, at which point they're going to start getting promoted rather quickly.
Well, it's almost like I kind of almost imagine that the Klingons kind of operate on the French Napoleonic model, which is if you survive the battle, you get a promotion.
Yeah, congratulations, you have learned how to live.
Yeah, you are not dead, which puts you in pretty high standing amongst a lot of Klingons.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting idea, though. Yeah, about how to maximize manpower and efficiency, and I hadn't thought about it like that. So, final question from Horatio82, and he asks, when are you guys going to be covering Babylon 5?
It's your channel. It's entirely
okay. Like, this is I included this question because I thought I had made this confession already. Maybe I have to the members, but maybe not to everyone else. I haven't watched any Babylon 5 at all, ever.
Oh dear.
Yeah. And like at this point, I feel like I'm just like it's so much to deal with when I'm so. And here's the other thing, like apart from that, it's also that this YouTube has deemed this channel a Star Trek channel. I'm sure Drachinfel's got a very similar experience.
Yes.
And so particularly in his early days, probably. And if you try to do anything but that, you get slapped down.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean it's it's one of those things. I mean, I have said in the past, and in fact, actually, also relatively recently, on either the last dry dock or possibly the one that's coming up now. I think it was the last one actually. I said, there are other bits of history I know a fair bit about. Some through personal interest, so I know a fair bit about the RAF bombing campaigns in World War II because one of my great uncles was there for most of it. And for the same reason, I know a fair bit about the British campaign in North Africa. You end up developing an interest in things when you've got two people that you greatly respect who tell you a lot about what they did, and they're fairly stuck into it. But also because of my heritage, I'm also incredibly interested in the Inca Empire, and I know a lot about that. I know a lot about a very narrow period of the late 14th, early 15th century because of what I do for reenactment. But there is no way I could ever really do that on my channel. Although there'd be a lot of people who'd be very happy to hear me talk about it, there would equally be a lot of other people who'd be like, I didn't come here to listen to, land-based history about the Inca Empire. I came here to listen about boats.
Yes.
And as you say, the algorithm would just be like, no, you're not talking about the things that you usually talk about, therefore we hate you. And I know YouTube's advice to that is usually, set up a second channel. But let's face it, how many much larger than either of our channels have we seen, go, I'm going to set up something for gaming or something for personal thoughts and reflections and so forth. And those second channels very rarely last very long.
Yeah, so they sort of grind along. Like the only way to kind of do that is to do the kind of mixed genre, mixed sci-fi, is to kind of do that from the start and just, from what I can tell, I don't know because I can't remember that far back, but I'm presuming it's what happened with like Space Dock and Temple Institute, who were the big multi-franchise channels. And I'm presuming they just ground through by just relentlessly sticking to doing a variety. And I've seen it. I've shouted out a channel called Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Yeah. And he does pretty much the exact same kind of thing. He does a variety. It's clear to me that his best content and the thing that people came to him for was The Expanse. People like that show, and he's been very on covering that. And when he's tried sort of the other kind of sci-fi, he's ended up just sort of getting buried and, just ends up becoming a bit of a grind.
And to be honest, it also requires you to be a fan of multiple franchises, the sci-fi's case, or to have studied multiple periods of history. In my case, I mean, I'm somewhat fortunate in the fact that the Inca Empire, which is probably I'd say outside of naval history, is probably the single strongest area of my historical understanding. The Inca Empire basically goes from nothing to dominating the entire high-altitude western part of South America to being crushed under the Spanish heel in about 200 years. So, on the grand scheme of things, it's not actually a massive amount of history that you have to learn compared to the Ottoman Empire, Volume 1, or something like that. And I think it's the same with sci-fi franchises. I'm, as you can probably guess, a big fan of Star Trek. I'm also a big fan of Star Wars and Babylon 5 and Stargate. I'm something of a fan of The Expanse, but if people wanted to sit down with me and talk about Star Wars, Stargate, Star Trek, or Babylon 5, I could talk all day. But if someone sat down with me and said, right, we want to talk about The Expanse, I'd be like, okay, we can do, but I'm going to be way, way behind. I think I'm about halfway through season 4, but even having watched 3 full and 1/2 seasons, I've not read the books. I've probably not watched any one episode more than twice, and there is a limited amount you can do with that. And let's not even get into things like
just that, yeah, like my old man, he really got into watching Battlestar Galactica, the new one, and that whole story, and it sounded fascinating and interesting. And I was like, but I don't have like the head space to like fit it in anymore. Like my head is so full of all this other stuff.
yeah, and it's similar with me. It's like I could watch Battlestar Galactica. And I will finish The Expanse, but I can tell you right now, I'm never going to know anything close to the amount that what you might define as a true fan would know, and therefore I'm going to be fairly useless outside of generic observations when it comes to those franchises. Whereas the four, as I mentioned before, the four core sci-fi franchises that I really like, I can talk all day about. So I think that is actually one of the things you have to bear in mind with YouTube is play to your strengths.
Yeah,
because it will both your viewers and YouTube will punish you if you step outside that zone.
Yes, I've said this before. If people want Star Wars, if people want something that's like in the vein of what I was trying to do with the Imperial Academy, which went nowhere, got immediately crushed, go watch the Imperial Historian. If you want Babylon 5, I don't know anyone who does that, but if it really comes down to it and you can't find anyone who does it, give it a go yourselves. And I'm not saying that in go do it yourself. Genuinely give it a go yourself, because that is exactly how this whole thing started. I didn't see anyone doing long form Star Trek, Discovery Channel style documentaries, and I was like, I'm gonna go do it. And then here we are.
Yeah,
so genuinely,
that's how my channel started.
Yeah. So genuinely, if you see a gap and you want to fill it, go.
Yeah, and and the other thing is, there's only so many hours in the day. Because I suppose the fifth sci-fi franchise I'm really into is 40K. But one, there's a fair number of 40K channels out there.
Yes.
which is weird, considering that like Star Trek's been around a lot longer, and I think there's actually more active large 40K channels than there are Star Trek ones.
Certainly, yeah.
But nevertheless, the thing is, obviously, the 40K channel market is kind of a bit saturated. But there are only so many hours in the day. So if I really want to get stuck into naval history, I might be able to incorporate another sci-fi franchise into some kind of second channel experiment if there was an easier way of doing that. But that would be it. And I suspect it's probably similar for yourself. If you had a second sci-fi franchise you wanted to look into, it would really start to eat into time, wouldn't it?
Yes, then I couldn't do all the Star Trek stuff. So it's it's a balancing act.
It's a balancing act, and let's be fair. The other thing is, to be perfectly honest, if you had one person being like the top leading channel for multiple different sci-fi franchises and various other things, one, you'd wonder if they'd got a time turner from Harry Potter, so they're generating the time to do it all. But also, it would tend to become I think would tend to become a slightly boring field. Because if you've got someone who's doing half a dozen sci-fi franchises and 3 different fields of history, etc., it's like, well, okay, what are the rest of us supposed to do? Are we just sit back and watch?
Yeah, you can't really get invested in the same way.
Yeah,
So that's our little rant on the ways of YouTube, but. That rounds out all our questions.
Yeah. All of that said, Warner Media, if you do want someone to completely dissect Babylon 5 top to bottom from a naval history standpoint and provide you lots of theoretical background knowledge, my email address is something I'd put some time aside for maybe next year. But yeah.
So yes, thank you very much very much to Drachinfel for coming along and answering our questions. And we'll do 3 more of these, just like there was some videos. This might have been broken up. I'll kind of decide when I look at it.
Yeah.
Just because this is easier to break up than the previous ones, which were
a bunch
very
of distinct questions we can split up. Although I suspect we're probably, apart from anything else, we're probably going to lose about 15 minutes from this current recording, thanks to all the Wi-Fi drops.
Yes.
So hopefully when we come to recording questions from video 2, I will be back with my wonderful 500 megabit per second internet connection, and that won't be a problem.
Yes, fingers crossed. Yes. So, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye-bye.